An Omega hid in the Alpha King wagon to flee a wedding, discovered miles away by fate. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to our main character. Emma Carter stood by the edge of the grand estate, the weight of her decision pressing down on her chest. She had always known this day would come, the day she would be forced into a marriage with a man she had never met, to fulfill an agreement made long before she had any say in it. But she never imagined it would feel this suffocating. The wedding, arranged by her family, was not a celebration of love, but a transaction, one that would bind her forever to a stranger. Emma was an Omega, the lowest rank in her pack, and that meant her choices were few and far between. Her parents had never seen her as anything more than a pawn in their plans to climb higher in the pack's hierarchy. And now, they had arranged for her to marry a man of high status, the alpha of a neighboring pack, who they claimed would bring honor and prosperity to their family. But Emma couldn't bear the thought of it. She had spent her entire life being overlooked, dismissed, and now, they expected her to marry a man she didn't even know, for nothing more than status and wealth. Emma's heart raced as she snuck away from the estate, the sound of footsteps echoing faintly in the distance. She had to escape. She didn't know where she would go, or what would happen next, but anything was better than being trapped in that marriage. She had heard rumors of a mysterious alpha, one who could protect her, one who could offer her a life of freedom. Emma didn't believe in fairy tales, but in that moment, she was willing to believe in anything that would give her a chance to escape. She found herself drawn to the woods, the familiar path leading her away. From the estate, toward the unknown. Her heart pounded as she walked, each step taking her further from the life she had known. She didn't know how long she had been walking, but the darkness of the night seemed to swallow her whole, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath her feet. Suddenly, she heard the rumble of wheels in the distance. Emma froze, her breath catching in her throat. A carriage was coming, and she had nowhere to hide. In a panic, she ran toward the nearest wagon, hoping to find cover. Without thinking, she crawled inside, hiding behind a stack of crates, praying she wouldn't be seen. The wagon rocked slightly as it began to move, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. She didn't know where it was headed, but it didn't matter. Anywhere was better than the life she was running from. Hours passed, the night growing colder as she sat in the cramped space, trying to make herself as small as possible. She had no idea who owned the wagon, but as the sun began to rise, she realized they were miles away from the estate. She had made it, or so she thought. The wagon slowed to a stop, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. She could hear voices outside, and her pulse quickened. She needed to stay hidden. But before she could move, a voice broke through the stillness, low and commanding. "What's this?" It was a man's voice, deep and rich, with an authority that made her blood run cold. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the wagon door creaked open, and she found herself face to face with the last person she expected to see. The Alpha King. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as the man's voice echoed through the air, sending a wave of panic through her. She stayed frozen in place, hoping the darkness of the night would protect her. But as the door to the wagon creaked open, a chill ran down her spine. She tried to shrink further into the shadows, but the man's gaze seemed to cut through the night like a blade. "What's this?" His voice was commanding, deep, and steady, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. Emma felt her throat tighten, a wave of fear washing over her. She had no idea what was happening, but she knew she had to remain still, silent, and hidden. The man's footsteps approached, and Emma could hear the sound of his boots on the wooden floor of the wagon. The space was small, and she felt trapped, unable to move without revealing herself. The door swung open fully, and a pair of strong hands gripped the edges, pulling it wider. Emma's breath hitched in her throat as the man's shadow filled the doorway. His tall, imposing figure blocked out the little light that filtered in from outside. "Who's there?" His voice softened just slightly, as if sensing something wasn't quite right, yet he didn't back away. Emma held her breath, not daring to move. She wasn't sure what to do, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't let him discover her. "I thought I heard something," the man muttered to himself. His eyes scanned the interior of the wagon, the intensity of his gaze making Emma feel as though he could see right through her. He took a step forward, his hand brushing against the crates, and Emma flinched, instinctively pulling herself back into the corner. He stopped in his tracks. "There's someone here," he said, his voice low and almost to himself. Emma's heart raced, and she forced herself to remain silent, praying he wouldn't look any closer. But fate wasn't on her side. With a sudden movement, the man stepped forward and reached into the shadows. His hand brushed against Emma's leg, and she gasped, the sound escaping before she could stop it. His hand paused, and then, with a swift motion, he grabbed her arm, pulling her into the light. Emma stumbled as she was yanked from her hiding spot, her eyes locking with the man's as she was forced to face him. The moment she saw him clearly, her breath caught in her throat. He was strikingly handsome, his features sharp and regal. His silver-gray eyes, filled with an intensity that almost made her freeze in place, stared back at her. He was dressed in dark, rich clothing, his presence overwhelming, commanding the very space around him. But what struck Emma the most was the cold aura that surrounded him. This was no ordinary man. This was the Alpha King. Her mind raced as she tried to process the situation. How had she ended up here? She had only wanted to escape, to get away from the life that had been chosen for her. She had never imagined that her flight would lead her directly into the hands of the most powerful man in the land. The Alpha King's gaze held hers, searching for answers, but he didn't speak immediately. Emma's heart hammered in her chest, the fear gripping her tightly. "What are you doing here?" His voice was soft, but held an undeniable authority. Emma opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. Her mind was a whirlwind of confusion. She couldn't explain herself, couldn't find the words. She was too afraid to speak, too terrified of what this man might do to her. The Alpha King's expression softened slightly, but the tension in the air was thick. "You're not from around here," he said, his tone less harsh now, though still filled with curiosity. Emma finally managed to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. I was running away. I didn't mean to stow away. I didn't know who you were." The Alpha King's eyes seemed to soften just a fraction. He released her arm, though his presence still loomed over her, intimidating and powerful. "Running away?" he asked, his voice laced with interest. Emma nodded, not sure what else to say. She had no idea what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. Her life had just changed forever. The Alpha King studied her for a moment longer before he spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost thoughtful. "You're lucky I found you first," he said, almost to himself. His words sent a chill through Emma's spine, though she couldn't tell if it was fear or something else. "You should come with me. It's not safe for someone like you to be out here alone." Emma's heart skipped a beat. What did he mean by that? She didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no other choice. The decision she had made to run had led her here, to this moment, and now she was caught in the Alpha King's gaze, unsure of what would come next. The only thing she knew was that her journey had just begun. The Alpha King's gaze remained steady on Emma, his silver-gray eyes studying her with a depth that made her heart race. She felt exposed, vulnerable under his scrutiny, but there was no way to escape now. The reality of the situation settled over her like a heavy cloak. She had fled a life she hated, only to land right in the arms of a man who could change everything. "Come with me," he repeated, his voice softer but still carrying that unyielding authority. Emma hesitated for a moment. She had no idea what he would do with her, no idea what fate had in store. But what choice did she have? The man she was supposed to marry, the life she was supposed to live, had already rejected her. Perhaps this was the escape she had been searching for. She nodded, though her hands trembled slightly as she tried to steady herself. The Alpha King stepped aside, motioning for her to follow. The wagon jolted to life once again, the wheels turning steadily over the dirt path. Emma climbed into the back of the wagon, her eyes flicking nervously to the Alpha King as he followed her. He didn't seem bothered by her presence, nor did he offer any reassurance. Instead, his attention was focused on the road ahead, his posture rigid as though constantly alert. The silence between them was thick, and Emma found herself wondering about him. What was he doing out here, so far from his kingdom? Why had he been in the woods at all? The man before her was the Alpha King of the Northern Territories, a ruler who commanded armies, controlled vast lands, and whose very name struck fear into the hearts of those who heard it. Yet, here he was, traveling in disguise, far from the comforts of his palace. Emma's curiosity grew, but she remained quiet, unsure of how to ask without offending him. The night stretched on, the journey taking them deeper into the wilderness. As the wagon moved, Emma's thoughts drifted back to the life she had left behind. Her family had never been kind to her. They had seen her as nothing more than a means to an end, a way to secure their place in the pack's hierarchy. Her parents had arranged for her to marry an alpha, a man she had never met, but someone they believed would bring power and status to their family. They had never considered what she wanted, what she needed. And when she had dared to refuse, to run away, they had dismissed her as a failure. Now here she was, alone with the Alpha King, a man who could crush her without a second thought. She shivered slightly, not from the cold, but from the weight of her own uncertainty. "You're quiet," the Alpha King said suddenly, his voice breaking the stillness of the night. Emma glanced up at him, surprised that he had spoken. I was just thinking," she said softly. "About what?" he asked, his gaze flicking briefly toward her before returning to the road. Emma hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. She didn't want to seem weak or foolish in front of him, but something about his presence made her feel strangely safe. "About my life," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "About how I ended up here." The Alpha King's expression softened just slightly, though his eyes remained as intense as ever. "You don't have to explain yourself to me," he said, his voice gentle yet firm. Emma was taken aback by the kindness in his words. She had expected him to be cold, distant, but there was something about him, something in the way he spoke, that made her feel like she wasn't completely invisible. "Thank you," she murmured, unsure of what else to say. The wagon continued its steady journey, the quiet rumble of the wheels the only sound between them. Emma didn't know how long they had been traveling, but she could feel the weight of exhaustion settling in. Her body ached from the strain of running, and she longed for rest. "We'll stop soon," the Alpha King said, as though reading her thoughts. "There's a cabin not far from here." Emma nodded, grateful for the promise of shelter. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness surrounding them like a vast ocean. But for the first time since she had fled her home, Emma allowed herself to relax just a little. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment, she felt a flicker of hope, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The Alpha King's presence was strange, unfamiliar, but it was also comforting in its own way. She wasn't sure what kind of man he was, but she was beginning to understand that there was more to him than met the eye. When they finally arrived at the cabin, Emma was too tired to ask any more questions. The Alpha King led her inside, where a small fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm glow over the rustic interior. "Get some rest," he said, his voice no longer commanding, but softer, almost caring. Emma nodded, feeling the exhaustion weigh down on her more than ever. She hadn't realized just how much she needed to sleep until now. As she lay down on the bed, the flickering firelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, Emma closed her eyes and allowed herself to drift off into a restless, yet much-needed, sleep. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a small sense of peace. The morning light filtered through the small window of the cabin, casting soft shadows on the wooden floor. Emma stirred in her sleep, the warmth of the fire still clinging to the air. Her body felt heavy, the weight of exhaustion still holding her in a tight grip. She had not slept so deeply in years, but now that she was awake, the reality of her situation rushed back to her. She was far from the life she had known, far from the wedding she had run away from, and now, in the presence of the Alpha King, she found herself in uncharted territory. Emma sat up slowly, stretching her arms above her head as she took in the simple room around her. The cabin was rustic, with a stone fireplace at one end and a few pieces of worn but sturdy furniture. There was a comfort in its simplicity, but it also felt foreign to her. She had always lived in a world of luxury, surrounded by expectations and obligations. This quiet, humble space was something she was not used to. As she stood and moved toward the small window, she could see the dense woods beyond. The world outside felt vast and open, and for a brief moment, Emma felt free. But that sense of freedom quickly faded when she remembered the man who had brought her here. The Alpha King. What was he thinking? Why had he taken her in when she was nothing more than an Omega on the run? Was it out of kindness, or was there something more to his actions? Emma's mind was a whirlwind of questions, but she could not find the answers. The night before, the Alpha King had seemed so distant, his cold demeanor hiding whatever emotions lay beneath. He had been kind enough to offer her shelter, but that didn't mean she understood him. His power, his authority, everything about him was overwhelming. She had barely spoken to him, and yet she could not shake the feeling that he was watching her, waiting for something. The door creaked open behind her, and Emma turned, her heart skipping a beat. The Alpha King stepped into the room, his presence filling the space. His sharp eyes locked with hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. He had changed since the night before, his appearance now more regal, more commanding, though still carrying the weariness of the journey. "Good morning," he said, his voice still firm but softer than it had been the night before. Emma hesitated for a moment before replying. "Good morning, Your Majesty," she said, unsure of how to address him. He seemed to study her for a moment, his gaze flicking over her face before nodding. "No need for formalities," he said, his tone casual now. "We're not in the palace, and I'm not here to give orders." Emma didn't know what to say. She had never been in a situation like this, never been in a place where she didn't have to follow someone's commands. She had always been expected to fit a role, to play her part in a life that was never her own. But now, with the Alpha King standing before her, she felt a strange sense of relief. She was no longer bound by her family's expectations, no longer forced into a marriage she didn't want. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The Alpha King raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by her gratitude. "For what?" he asked, his expression softening. Emma swallowed hard, unsure of how to express what she felt. "For helping me," she said, her words coming out more vulnerable than she intended. I didn't think anyone would." The Alpha King's eyes flickered with something Emma couldn't quite place. Was it empathy? Sympathy? She couldn't tell, but it made her heart flutter. "You don't need to thank me," he said, stepping closer. "I did what anyone would have done in my place." Emma looked up at him, searching his face for any hint of dishonesty. But there was nothing. He seemed genuine, and for the first time since she had met him, she felt a small flicker of trust. "I'm not the monster everyone says I am," the Alpha King continued, his voice steady. "I do what I have to do, but that doesn't mean I take pleasure in causing harm." Emma swallowed, the weight of his words sinking in. She had heard the rumors, the stories about the ruthless Alpha King who ruled with an iron fist. But now, standing in front of him, she saw something different. Something human. "I never thought you were a monster," she said, surprising herself with her honesty. "I thought you were just someone I needed to run from." The Alpha King chuckled softly, the sound unexpected and warm. "I don't blame you for that," he said, his smile barely there, but enough to soften his features. "I've made enemies, and I've done things I'm not proud of, but I'm not going to hurt you." Emma nodded, though she couldn't fully shake the lingering doubt. There was still so much she didn't know about him, so much she didn't understand. "So what now?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. The Alpha King paused, his eyes searching hers. "Now," he said slowly, "we figure out what comes next." His words were simple, but the weight behind them was clear. Emma didn't know what to expect, but she knew one thing for certain. Her journey had just taken an unexpected turn. The Alpha King stood quietly, his gaze fixed on Emma as the weight of the moment lingered between them. Emma shifted uncomfortably, her mind racing with all the questions she had yet to ask. She had expected this to be a fleeting encounter, an unexpected detour on her escape from the life she had been forced into, but now it felt like everything had changed. The Alpha King's presence was overwhelming, and for the first time since she had left her family's home, Emma felt like she was truly at a crossroads. "What do you want from me?" Emma asked softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. The words had been building inside her for hours, but now that they were out, she realized just how vulnerable they made her feel. The Alpha King looked at her, his silver-gray eyes studying her for a long moment. His expression softened, and he sighed, the weight of the situation pressing on him as well. "I want nothing from you," he said finally, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I never intended to be the one to show you kindness. But you are here now, and I believe fate has a way of bringing people together when they least expect it. Emma's heart skipped a beat at his words. He spoke with such certainty, such calm authority, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that caught her off guard. He wasn't as cold and unapproachable as she had imagined. You didn't have to bring me here, she replied quietly. You didn't have to help me. I could have been fine on my own. The Alpha King shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible smile flickering on his lips. I don't believe that for a second, he said. No one can truly be fine on their own. We all need help sometimes, even if we don't admit it. Emma swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. She wasn't used to this kind of honesty, this kind of raw vulnerability. She had spent her life hiding behind the walls her family had built around her, never allowing anyone to get too close. But something about the Alpha King's words made her want to let down her guard, even just a little. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm her racing thoughts. Why did you help me? She asked, her voice trembling ever so slightly. What do you want from me in return? The Alpha King's gaze softened, and he stepped closer, closing the distance between them. I don't want anything from you, Emma, he said, his voice quiet but firm. You are not a pawn in my game. You're not a tool for me to use. I simply saw someone in need, and I chose to act. Emma stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp his words. Was he really telling the truth? Was he really as different from everyone else she had known as he seemed? Why me? She whispered. The Alpha King sighed deeply, his expression pensive. Because I know what it feels like to be trapped, to feel like there's no way out, he said, his voice low and filled with an emotion Emma had never expected to hear from someone so powerful. I've been there, Emma, and I don't want anyone to feel the way I did, trapped in a life they didn't choose. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she heard the pain in his voice, the raw honesty that echoed in his words. She had never seen this side of him before, the ruler, the Alpha King. For the first time, she saw the man behind the title, the person who had once been lost, just like her. I don't know what to say, Emma murmured, her heart pounding in her chest. I never thought anyone would understand. I thought I was the only one who felt like this. The Alpha King looked at her with a steady, comforting gaze. You're not alone, he said gently. And you don't have to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders by yourself. We all have our struggles. It's what makes us human. Emma's eyes welled with tears, though she quickly blinked them away, not wanting to show any more weakness. But the kindness in the Alpha King's eyes, the understanding in his voice, made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time, a glimmer of hope. She had been running for so long, running from a life she never wanted, and now, in this cabin with the Alpha King standing before her, she felt like maybe she could stop running. Maybe she didn't have to be afraid anymore. She had no idea what would come next, but for the first time, she wasn't as afraid of what the future held. Thank you, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Thank you for seeing me, for helping me. The Alpha King gave her a small, reassuring smile. You don't need to thank me. You deserve to be seen. Emma felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words, and for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could have a life worth living. A life where she wasn't just a tool for someone else's gain. A life where she could be free. But even as she felt the hope rising inside her, she knew that the road ahead would not be easy. The Alpha King was not just a man. He was a king, a ruler with responsibilities and burdens she couldn't yet understand. And she was still an Omega, with no clear place in his world. But perhaps, for once, the future didn't have to be a path of fear and uncertainty. Perhaps, for once, she could take control of her own destiny. The following morning, Emma awoke to the soft, golden light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls. She stretched slowly, feeling the weight of her body relax after the restless sleep she had experienced. The warmth of the fire from the night before still lingered in the room, and for the first time since she had fled, Emma felt a sense of peace settle over her. The sounds of the forest outside were soothing, almost like a lullaby, and the steady rhythm of the wind rustling the leaves added to the tranquility of the moment. As she lay there, her thoughts began to drift back to the Alpha King. He had been a mystery to her ever since their first meeting, a man of power and authority, but there was something more to him, something beneath the cold exterior that had intrigued her from the very start. She had expected him to be like the others, distant, unapproachable, and ruthless. But last night, He had shown her a side of himself that was unexpected. He had been kind, understanding even, in a way that made her question everything she thought she knew about him. Emma couldn't deny that a part of her felt drawn to him. She had never imagined that her life would lead her here, to a cabin in the woods with the Alpha King of the Northern Territories. It felt like a strange twist of fate, but now, she wasn't sure if it was a bad thing. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she might have found a place where she could be free, where she wasn't just a pawn in someone else's game. But even as she felt a flicker of hope, the reality of her situation crept in. She was still an Omega, and she was still bound by the constraints of her role in the pack. The Alpha King may have shown her kindness, but what did he want in return? What was his real motive for helping her? Emma pushed the thoughts aside for now. She couldn't afford to dwell on what-ifs. She had already taken the first step by running away, and now she had to trust that, whatever came next, she would be able to handle it. Rising from the bed, she stretched and made her way to the small window, peering out at the forest beyond. The world outside was calm, serene even, and for a moment, she could almost forget the chaos of her past. The decision she had made to flee her arranged marriage still haunted her, but she didn't regret it. Not yet. As she turned to face the rest of the cabin, she saw the Alpha King standing near the door, looking out at the landscape with a contemplative expression. "You're up early," Emma said, her voice tentative, though she wasn't sure why. He turned to face her, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I've always been an early riser," he replied, his voice calm and collected. "It gives me time to think, to clear my mind before the day begins." Emma nodded, not sure what to say next. She had never been good at small talk, especially with someone like him. But there was something about the way he looked at her, something that made her feel like she could open up. "Do you ever feel trapped?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. The Alpha King's expression softened, and he took a step closer to her. "Of course," he said quietly. "Everyone feels trapped at times, whether they admit it or not. The weight of responsibility, the expectations of others. It can feel like a cage sometimes." Emma met his gaze, surprised by his honesty. She had expected him to brush off her question, to pretend that he had everything under control. But instead, he was speaking from a place of understanding, a place that made her feel like he was no longer just a king, but a man with his own struggles. "I never thought someone like you would feel trapped," Emma admitted, her voice almost a whisper. "You're the Alpha King, after all. You have everything." The Alpha King sighed, his gaze drifting toward the window. "People think that because I hold power, I have everything I want. But power comes with its own set of chains. I may command armies and control vast lands, but I don't have the freedom to live as I wish. Every decision I make impacts others, and that burden is heavier than most realize." Emma felt a strange sense of relief wash over her. For the first time, she didn't feel so alone in her struggle. She wasn't the only one carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. The Alpha King had his own burdens, his own challenges, and maybe that made him more human than she had first thought. "So what do you do?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. "How do you handle it?" The Alpha King turned to her, his expression thoughtful. "I keep moving forward," he said simply. "I don't have the luxury of dwelling on what I can't change. I face the challenges head-on, one step at a time. It's the only way to survive in a world like this." Emma nodded slowly, taking in his words. She had always felt like she was running, but maybe there was more to it than just escaping. Maybe survival meant more than simply avoiding pain. It meant facing it, acknowledging it, and finding a way to move forward despite it. "I think I'm starting to understand," Emma said softly. The Alpha King gave her a small smile, a hint of approval in his eyes. "Good. That's a start." As they stood there in the quiet cabin, surrounded by the stillness of the forest, Emma realized that perhaps she wasn't as lost as she had once thought. The path ahead was uncertain, but with the Alpha King's presence, she felt a spark of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her way. She wasn't alone anymore. And for the first time in a long while, Emma allowed herself to believe that she could shape her own future. The days that followed were filled with an unexpected calm. Emma found herself falling into a routine, waking up with the dawn and spending her days in the quiet cabin. The Alpha King, Lucas, seemed to be everywhere yet nowhere at the same time, always present but never intrusive. There were moments when she would catch him watching her from the doorway, his silver-gray eyes thoughtful, and yet, there was a tenderness there that she had never imagined. They spoke little, but when they did, their conversations were often filled with a shared understanding of the weight they both carried. Emma began to feel something shift within herself. She was no longer just the girl running from her past, but someone who was learning to stand on her own, someone with the possibility of a future beyond the life she had known. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the cabin's wooden floor, Emma found herself sitting by the fire, absently tracing the patterns in the flame. She had been thinking about the life she had left behind, her family, the wedding, the expectations. But now, in the quiet solitude of this place, she was beginning to wonder if there was something more for her. The sound of the door creaking open interrupted her thoughts, and she looked up to find Lucas standing in the doorway. His presence was commanding, but today there was something different about him, an ease in his posture, a softness in his gaze that was unfamiliar. "Are you busy?" he asked, his voice calm. But there was an undercurrent of something unspoken. Emma shook her head, offering him a small smile. "No, not at all." She motioned for him to come in. He stepped inside, his gaze scanning the room before settling on her. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her heart race in a way she couldn't explain. "I was thinking," he began, his voice low, "that it's time we talk about what comes next." Emma's heart skipped a beat at his words. She had been waiting for this moment, though she hadn't known it until now. The uncertainty that had lingered in her mind, the questions she had been afraid to ask, now seemed to come to the surface. "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Lucas walked over to the window, his back to her as he looked out at the forest. "You know why you're here," he said, his voice distant. "But I think it's time to address the elephant in the room." Emma's pulse quickened. She had been avoiding the subject, too afraid to confront the reality of her situation. But now, it seemed there was no escaping it. She stood up slowly, crossing the room to stand beside him. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas turned to face her, his eyes locking with hers. "I'm not asking for anything from you," he said quietly. "But I do want you to understand the reality of your situation. You've been running from your past, but sooner or later, you'll have to face it. And when that time comes, I'll be here." Emma felt a lump form in her throat. The vulnerability in his words took her by surprise. He wasn't offering her protection out of obligation. He was offering it out of something deeper, something more genuine. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice shaking slightly. I'm not asking you to save me." Lucas smiled, a soft, almost sad smile that made Emma's heart ache. "I'm not saving you," he said gently. "I'm just offering you a choice." Emma looked at him, her mind racing. A choice. She had spent her life being told what to do, what was expected of her. But here, in this small cabin, with the Alpha King standing before her, she realized that for the first time, she had the power to choose. "What kind of choice?" she asked, her voice trembling. Lucas took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. "The choice to stay here, to start anew, or the choice to face your past," he said softly. "The world is waiting for you, Emma. But I won't push you into anything. The decision is yours to make." Emma's heart pounded in her chest. She had never been given a choice like this before. She had always been controlled, always been a part of someone else's plan. But now, standing in front of Lucas, she realized that the power to shape her own future was in her hands. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could face it. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," she admitted, her voice quiet. Lucas smiled again, this time with warmth. "That's okay," he said. "You don't have to have it all figured out. We'll take it one step at a time." For a moment, there was silence between them, a comfortable silence that held no pressure, no expectations. Emma felt the weight on her shoulders lighten, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to breathe. "Thank you," she whispered. "For everything." Lucas nodded, his eyes softening. "You don't need to thank me. You're here now, and that's what matters." As the day stretched into evening, Emma realized that the future was uncertain. Yes, but it was hers to shape. And with that realization came a sense of peace. She wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't trapped in a life she didn't want. She had a chance, a real chance, to live for herself. And whatever came next, she would face it with courage, no matter what. The Alpha King had given her the freedom to choose. And for that, she would always be grateful. The days passed slowly, and Emma began to feel herself adjusting to the strange new life she had found with the Alpha King. The cabin, while modest, became a place of quiet refuge. She spent her mornings by the fire, her hands busy with simple tasks, and her evenings talking to Lucas about anything and everything. The connection between them had grown steadily, a slow but steady build that neither of them had expected. Lucas was still a mystery in many ways, but Emma began to see beyond the cold exterior. He was not the tyrant many believed him to be. There was kindness in his actions, a depth to his character that made her question everything she had been taught about him. One morning, as the sun rose over the horizon, Emma found herself sitting by the window, watching the mist rise from the forest floor. The air was crisp, and the peaceful silence of the cabin gave her a rare moment of clarity. She thought about the choices she had made, the escape she had taken. She thought about the life she had left behind and what the future could hold. She was no longer just running. She was beginning to find a sense of belonging here, in this quiet cabin with the Alpha King. The decision to trust him, to allow herself to be seen and not just hidden away, felt like the first real choice she had ever made for herself. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas' voice broke the silence, and Emma turned to find him standing at the door, watching her with a curious expression. She smiled faintly, trying to push away the uncertainty that still lingered in the back of her mind. "Just thinking about everything," she said softly. "About what comes next." Lucas stepped inside, closing the door behind him. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond that had been forming without either of them fully realizing it. He sat down beside her, his presence calming, as always. "You don't have to have all the answers," he said, his voice gentle. "None of us do. But you're here now, and that's enough." Emma looked at him, meeting his gaze. For a moment, everything else faded into the background. She had spent so much of her life trying to meet expectations, trying to fit into a mold that was never hers to fill. But here, with Lucas, she felt free to simply be herself. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come into the woods that day?" Emma asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. Lucas looked at her, his silver-gray eyes thoughtful. "Every day," he said quietly. "But maybe that's what makes this so powerful. We don't know what the future holds, but we get to choose how we face it." His words struck a chord deep within her. The idea of choosing, of having control over her life for the first time, was both terrifying and liberating. She didn't have all the answers, but perhaps that was okay. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do," Emma admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm still not sure what's next for me." Lucas reached over, placing a hand on hers. The touch was warm and reassuring, and for the first time, Emma didn't feel so lost. "You don't have to know yet," he said. "Take your time. No one is rushing you." His words brought a sense of peace she hadn't expected. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was being pushed to make a decision, to choose a path she wasn't ready for. It was a strange feeling, but it was also comforting. "Thank you," Emma said, her voice soft. "For everything." Lucas gave her a small smile, a look of understanding passing between them. "You're welcome," he replied. "And just so you know, you're not alone in this." The warmth of his words, the genuine sincerity in his voice, made Emma feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms. She had a choice now, and that made all the difference. As the day stretched into afternoon, Emma sat quietly by the window, looking out at the peaceful landscape before her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt like she could take on whatever came her way. And with Lucas by her side, she didn't feel so alone anymore. There was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Emma felt ready to walk it. The weight of the past was still there, lingering in the back of her mind, but it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. She was no longer defined by the expectations of others. She was defined by her own choices. And with that realization, a quiet strength began to take root inside her. She was no longer running. She was ready to stand tall, to face whatever came next with courage. And no matter what happened, she knew she had the power to choose her own path. The following days were filled with a calm that Emma had never known before. The weight of her past life, the expectations and fears that had once dominated her thoughts, began to fade as she settled into the routine of the cabin. There was no more pressure, no more rush. The Alpha King, Lucas, seemed to understand the need for space, and though he was always nearby, his presence didn't feel overwhelming. Instead, it was a quiet reassurance that she wasn't alone. It was a strange but comforting feeling to wake up every morning and know that she had a place here, even if she didn't know exactly what her future would look like. The forest outside the cabin was calm, the sun shining through the trees like a golden promise of the possibilities ahead. Emma spent her days tending to small tasks around the cabin, cooking, cleaning, and occasionally tending to the small garden Lucas had started. There was a peacefulness to it, a simplicity she had never experienced before. But it was more than just the peaceful life that drew her in. It was the way Lucas treated her, the way he spoke to her, and the way he made her feel like she mattered, like her choices mattered. It was a far cry from the way her family had treated her, seeing her only as a tool to secure power and status. She hadn't realized how much she had longed for real connection until now. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting a warm, amber glow over the land, Lucas sat beside her by the fire. They hadn't spoken much that day, each of them lost in their own thoughts, but there was a quiet understanding between them. "You're quiet tonight," Lucas said, breaking the silence. Emma looked up at him, a little surprised. He had a way of noticing things she hadn't even realized herself. "Just thinking," she replied, her voice soft. "About what?" he asked, his tone gentle. She paused for a moment, trying to put her thoughts into words. "About everything," she said. "About how different things are now." Lucas nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "It's a lot to process, I know," he said. "But you don't have to figure it all out at once." Emma looked into the fire, the flames flickering and dancing, and she found herself smiling. There was something about Lucas's calmness, his certainty, that made her feel like everything would be okay, even if she didn't have all the answers. "I know," she said. "I just feel like I'm starting to see things differently. Like I'm finally in control of my own life. For the first time, I feel like I'm not just waiting for something to happen." Lucas's eyes softened as he looked at her. "That's good," he said quietly. "You should never feel like you're just waiting. Life's too short for that. You have the power to choose your own path, Emma, and I think you're starting to realize that." His words struck a chord deep within her. She had spent so long feeling like she had no control over her life, like everything had already been decided for her. But now, with Lucas, she was beginning to see that the future wasn't set in stone. She had choices. She could make her own decisions. And for the first time, that felt like enough. "I still don't know what comes next," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I think I'm okay with that." Lucas gave her a reassuring smile. "You don't need to have everything figured out," he said. "The important thing is that you're taking steps forward, even if those steps are small." Emma nodded, feeling a sense of peace settle in her chest. For so long, she had been running from her past, from her family's expectations, from a future that had been forced on her. But now, here, with Lucas, she wasn't running anymore. She was moving forward. The fire crackled softly as they sat together in comfortable silence, the weight of the world seeming just a little lighter. Emma wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, she didn't feel as afraid of it. She had found a place for herself here, a place where she could be free to choose her own path, and that was more than she had ever dared to hope for. As the night stretched on and the fire burned low, Emma knew that there was still much to learn, still many questions to answer, but she no longer felt like she had to face them alone. With Lucas by her side, she felt like she could handle whatever came next. Together, they would face the future, whatever it might bring. And for the first time in her life, Emma felt like she was finally in control of her own destiny.